Okay, hi everyone. My name is Ben Lau, Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum of Chicago. I'm so very happy and grateful to welcome you all to this event. And we are the only Chinese American museum in the Midwest. Our mission is to advance the appreciation of Chinese American culture through exhibitions, education, and research, and to preserve the past, present, and future of Chinese Americans, primarily in the Midwest. Today's lecture topic is Sailing to Cathay, Maritime Trade Routes to Asia before and after the arrival of the Europeans turn of the 16th century. It explores the vibrant maritime trade routes that existed in the Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean, and South China Sea before and after the arrival of the Europeans in Asia at the turn of the 16th century. Maritime trade routes were the global highways of the ancient world, carrying commodities, art, ideas, people, and religion between Europe and Asia, with significant societal impacts felt at both ends. Today, we are very excited to have Andrew Singer talk about this topic. Andrew is a writer and speaker about China, a traveler, lover, collector of books and Chinese snuff bottles, and by day, a land use and environmental permitting lawyer on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. He dreamed about China from a young age and spent a year in China during college in the mid-1980s. He has been a Chinese translator with the US government. He has skydived, hiked the Salkantay Trail in Peru, and camped on the Great Wall of China. Andrew writes a thrice-monthly newsletter on China, America, and cross-cultural connections. I will put down his website and his newsletter in the chat, shortly after this. Before I ask Andrew to give us the presentation, I would like to let you know that this event is being recorded. If you do not want to have your face being recorded, please turn off your camera. Also, please mute your mic during presentation. The recording will stop when we have the Q&A session at around 2:50 p.m. Central Time, 3:50 p.m. Eastern Time. You can type in your questions in the chat. Thank you for your cooperation. Today's event is free to attend. Please consider making a donation to our museum through the link in the chat to support our effort on creating quality public programming and new exhibitions. Thank you. And before I hand it over to Andrew, I would like to recognize a few individuals. Mabel Manard, who is our board vice president and who is also the head of our public programming committee. So, Mabel, you can raise your hand to the audience. Okay, now, Andrew, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ben, and good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity that the museum is giving me to discuss this intriguing time in world history with you this afternoon. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay. It was at the close of the 15th century that Europeans sailed directly to Asia for the first time and came into widespread contact with cultures and civilizations that were home to a vibrant and well-developed maritime trade system already. The Portuguese were the first to arrive. They were followed by the Spanish, Dutch, English, French, and others, as the European countries slowly became dominant in large areas of the world far beyond their shores. There were European travelers and merchants to the wider world before this time, but they were the exception, not the rule. This is not to say that the Europeans before the 15th and 16th centuries did not know about Asia. They did. Chinese silk, tea, and porcelain, Southeast Asian spices, aromatics, and hardwoods, and Indian textiles, pepper, iron, and diamonds were already in demand in Middle Ages Europe. Knowledge of Chinese and Asian societies, customs, philosophies, and political structures, incomplete and or inaccurate though they were not unheard of on the continent. The ancient overland Silk Road routes account for some of this commerce and communication, but even more came from merchant traders who brought products, information, and news back and forth on the seas from India and points east, through the Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea to ports in Arabia, the Mediterranean, and beyond. So why did the Europeans not travel directly to Asia before the 15th century? They wanted to. Cutting out the middlemen on the in-demand luxury goods would make them more money, increase profits, and it would also yield them more access and more control. But getting there was not that easy. And now as I go to change my screen, it is not changing. I do not understand why this is happening, and I apologize. I'm going to try to start again with the sharing. There we go. The Mediterranean Sea did not provide a direct water connection to the Indian Ocean. And the routes through Arabia, the Persian Gulf, and elsewhere were controlled by others. And way back at this time still, much of Europe still did not believe that there was a direct water connection to Asia. The blame for this idea, if blame is due, may go all the way back to this man in this map, Ptolemy. In approximately 150 CE, Claudius Ptolemy, who was an Egyptian astronomer and geographer, made this map when he was at the Library of Alexandria. His map depicts a solid terrestrial connection along the southern boundary of the Indian Ocean between Africa and Asia. As you can see here, the Indian Ocean on Ptolemy's map is in effect a lake. The great Arab geographer Al-Sharif al-Ijisi also prepared a world map in the 12th century that showed a land mass extending out from Africa towards Asia. As many Islamic mapmakers did at the time, though, he put south at the top of his map, and that's the map that's shown here. The three dots in the upper right, connected to a mountain, are the source of the Nile. Asia is off to the left, and an upside-down Europe is at the bottom right of this map. 300 years later still, near the end of the 15th century, Francesco Berlingueri of Florence prepared a grand map of the world in which he continued to show this large terra incognita wrapped around the Indian Ocean, blocking direct water access to Asia. So if the Indian Ocean was a closed body of water, there was no way for the Europeans to get there. This, though, did not stop the hunt. And in fact, there were plenty of people in Europe who knew or suspected that the Indian Ocean was either fully or partially open. Searching for a direct route to Asia was one thing, but that was not the original reason that the Portuguese were the first Europeans to explore down the west coast of Africa. During the 15th century, while the Spanish sent Italian Cristoforo Colombo across the Atlantic Ocean searching for the Spice Islands, Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal and his successors sent ships to probe south down the northwest coast of Africa. Prince Henry was initially not looking to trade with Asia, but rather to trade with Africa. Europe needed gold and slaves, and Africa had an abundance of both. The continent was home to existing trade routes that Africans had pioneered on their west coast. Ports and people in this area were ready to trade when the newcomers arrived. As for venturing further down the African coast, there were other concerns beyond just the old Ptolemaic view that you couldn't get there. There were legends of the Torrid Zone, a region of lore that was reputedly so hot that no one could traverse it and survive. There were legends of sea monsters that destroyed ships that dared enter. For myriad reasons, there was an invisible point of no return line that European sailors feared for the longest time. By the late 15th century, however, the Portuguese were not only actively searching for this water route around Africa, but they were public about their intentions. In 1485, Portugal's ambassador to Rome delivered an oration of obedience from King João II to Pope Innocent VIII, in which the Portuguese gave an update on their explorations down the west side of Africa and announced, incorrectly as it later turned out, that they had voyaged within days of proving a water connection to Asia. When Bartholomew Dias briefly rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 and came back to tell the tale, the Portuguese took the first tentative European steps into a maritime system that was well established and well traveled. Arab, Muslim, Jewish, as well as Indian and Christian traders had for centuries been plying the waters of the Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea from Southeast Asia and China in the east to Madagascar off the southeast coast of Africa. The active trade routes sailed from Siraf, Basra, Hormuz, and Aden over to the west coast of India, down and around to Ceylon and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, through the Malacca Strait between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, into Indonesia and the Spice Islands, and up past modern Vietnam to China and Japan. Established ports along the way allowed for trading to be conducted, repairs to be made, and water and supplies to be reprovisioned. Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama tapped into this maritime system when he traveled to Calicut on the west coast of India in 1498, the first direct European voyage across the Indian Ocean. Here he encountered the first of many Asian economic centers. In addition to India, there were powerful kingdoms further east, including the Srivijaya on the Sumatran side of the Malay Archipelago and the Champa in what is now Vietnam. The peoples and societies of these kingdoms were integral parts of the maritime circuit and were long familiar with foreign traders and travelers when the winds eventually blew the European newcomers to their shores. The monsoon winds in the Indian Ocean were key, for they governed the maritime trade between Asia and Europe. Ships had to leave China in late autumn or winter before the northeast monsoon to take them south, west, and north. The same was true in the Persian Gulf at the other end of the trade route. As Edward Schaefer has written, quote, "And even before the merchant vessels were leaving China, the ships of Islam were underway. If they left Basra or Siraf in September or October, they would be out of the Persian Gulf in time for the fair monsoon of winter to carry them across the Indian Ocean, and could expect to catch the stormy southwest monsoon in June to carry them northward from Malaya across the South China Sea to their destinations in South China. The rule, both east and west, was southward in winter, northward in summer." The Chinese were also longstanding participants in the maritime world. Chinese maritime trade contact with Southeast Asia is measured in millennia. In the official Han Shu, book of the former Han Dynasty, which was written predominantly during the 1st century CE, it is recorded that, quote, "Chinese vessels were visiting Sumatra, Burma, Ceylon, and southeastern India during the Western Han Dynasty," end quote. During the Tang Dynasty, Jia Dan, a scholar and official, described a sea route from Canton to Baghdad through the Malacca Straits, Indian Ocean, and Arabian Sea with stops at Singapore, the Nicobar Islands, Ceylon, and India. During the early 13th century, some 50 years before Marco Polo arrived in China, a late Southern Song Dynasty official based in the southern Chinese city of Quanzhou compiled the Gazetteer of Foreign Lands, detailing knowledge of faraway places known to the Chinese. The Gazetteer contained entries from cities and countries spread across Southeast Asia, South Asia, Arabia, and Eastern Africa, of how kings, officials, and commoners lived and traveled, wore their hair, ate and acted, what products they were known to trade, and travel times. The readers traveled as far away as the Mediterranean Sea to see the shining lighthouse of Alexandria and witness the mighty force of Sicily's Mount Etna. With the fall of the Sung Dynasty and the rise of the Yuan Dynasty in the late 13th century, Kublai Khan sent armadas to invade Japan and to battle the Cham, the Annamese, and the Kadiri, kingdoms spread across Southeast Asia. None of these military efforts were successful, but trade nevertheless continued unabated. For centuries before the arrival of European ships to China's ports, the southern city of Quanzhou, in what is now Fujian province across from Taiwan, was China's connection with the world. Depending on your vantage point for maritime trade, cosmopolitan Quanzhou was either the beginning or the end of the line. Song Dynasty Quanzhou in the year 1000 has been described by Professor Valerie Hansen as follows. The street is packed with customers buying pearl necklaces from Sri Lanka, ornaments carved from African ivory, perfumes preserved with stabilizers from Tibet and Somalia, vials crafted from Baltic amber, and furniture made from every imaginable aromatic wood. The smell of foreign incense permeates the air. A shop around the corner sells expensive and high-tech products alongside versions modified for local consumers. Depending on the holiday, Hindu, Muslim, or Buddhist worshippers join the throngs. Almost 300 years later, Marco Polo described Quanzhou, he called it Zaitun, as follows when he visited during the Yuan Dynasty in the late 13th century. At the end of 5 days' journey from Fuzhou, you arrive at the noble and handsome city of Zaitun, which has a port famous for the vast quantity of shipping, loaded with merchandise that enters it and is afterward distributed through every part of the province of Manzi. The quantity of pepper imported there is so great that what is carried to Alexandria to supply the demand of the western parts of the world is trifling in comparison, perhaps not more than 100th part. It is indeed impossible to convey any idea of the number of merchants and the accumulation of goods in this place, which is held to be one of the largest ports in the world. It is estimated by the merchants that their costs, including customs and freight, amount to half the value of the cargo. And yet, their profit on the other half is so large that they are always happy to return with another stock of merchandise. The pinnacle of Chinese maritime activity took place between 1405 and 1433 during the Ming Dynasty with the 7 ocean voyages of eunuch Admiral Zheng He. These voyages sailed with up to 27,000 or more sailors and soldiers on dozens to hundreds of ships. The most grand of these vessels were treasure ships that dwarfed anything previously seen. The treasure ships were by far the largest, most technologically sophisticated sailing ships to take to the oceans to that time, with waterproof compartmentalized hulls and mechanical stern post rudders. The fleets launched from port in Nanjing on the Yangtze River and sailed out to the ocean and down to the Chinese coast to Quanzhou, before sailing across the South China Sea and down to the Kingdom of Champa. From there, they crossed to Java and then passed through the Malacca Straits and the mighty Srivijaya Empire, popping into the Indian Ocean and then up to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and over to Ceylon. From there, they swung around the southern tip of India to ports at Calicut, Cochin, and Goa on the Malabar coast. After that, it was a straight shot across the Arabian Sea to Hormuz and Aden and on to the northeast coast of Africa. If this route sounds familiar, though in reverse, it is. Like the Portuguese to come almost a century after Zheng He himself was following long-established maritime trade routes. In all, Zheng He's fleets made dozens of repeated stops during each voyage in long-existing ports of call. There remains much debate about the purposes of Zheng He's voyages, and there likely is no one answer. These voyages were not of exploration, nor were they of conquest and colonization in the later European sense. Zheng He fought battles at times, and the threat of force in his mighty presence would have served political aims of Ming Dynasty power projection. The tribute system, a political state of mutual gift exchange, and both state-sponsored and private trade were certainly important aspects of the voyages. They provided regular contact between China and other kingdoms and countries, of ambassadors, merchants, and civilizations. One scholar commenting on the Ming Dynasty has stated that during the reigns of Yongle, Chinese ships, Chinese sailors, and Chinese maritime technology dominated not only Asian waters, but also the Indian and Arabic sea lanes. Trade for Chinese products heading out and foreign goods heading back was exploited by the Chinese with economic bases set up in many of the same kingdoms ruling Southeast and South Asia at the time. In preparation for the sixth voyage in 1421, the emperor, quote, not only ordered Zheng He to take imperial orders together with brocade, gauze, thin satin, and other valuables as awards to the tributary states, but also provided his fleet with silver ingots, cotton cloth, copper coins, and other goods for trade activities in the Indian Ocean. The exporting of porcelain from the central country, China, was big. The importing of spices into China was bigger. It has been suggested that the profits from Zheng He's spice-centered trade generated a revenue for the Ming government that amounted to more than 10 times of the overall gains from foreign trade during both the Song and the Yuan dynasties. The above is but a brief history of maritime trade connecting Europe and Asia and the Middle East before the Europeans made their presence known in force. Now, fast forward to the turn of the 16th century, and Vasco de Gama shows up after following these same trade routes in an easterly direction. Setting off from Portugal, he traced the new Portuguese routes down the west coast of Africa, around the feared Cape of Good Hope, formerly known as the Cape of Storms, and up to Madagascar and Mozambique. From there, though, he, like Admiral Zheng He, was merely following the sea routes plied for generations by maritime traders. De Gama hired an experienced foreign navigator to help him across the Indian Ocean. And in this, he unwittingly and unknowingly also harkened back to Admiral Zheng He, who he also used foreign pilots and navigators during his voyages. The Portuguese quickly took control along the historic trade routes with violent efficiency, establishing forts at Hormuz, Goa, and Malacca. How did the Portuguese and then other European merchants communicate with the civilizations they met in Asia? It was not easy. There were no dictionaries, nor often even standardized languages. Europeans, particularly the Jesuits, would eventually study Chinese and other languages as the centuries passed. However, this option was not present at the beginning. Relying on others was one method. The experience in the existence of Chinese, Indian, and experienced Jewish and Muslim traders and merchants in various ports helped, as they would have already picked up some of the local languages and had some facility to communicate. As for de Gama's entry itself into Calicut, the first person to disembark from his ship, which was not de Gama himself, but rather a convict exile he sent to test the waters, so to speak, met a Tunisian Muslim who confronted the stranger in either Castilian or Genoese. This member of de Gama's crew responded in Portuguese, "We come in search of Christians and spices." As the Europeans were soon to discover, Arabic was the recognized common tongue for maritime trade in Asia. In addition, words from one language were soon to be incorporated into others. For example, Persian and Arabic words became part of Chinese maritime vocabulary. Pidgin hybridizations full of jargon developed. Hand gestures and signs utilizing a common understanding of the sea and trade were likely employed then and continue to be so used even to today. The Europeans who arrived in Asia also employed a more direct approach of kidnapping local individuals, families, and groups to bring back and train as future interpreters. Language challenges were not the only roadblocks to smooth communication and relations during the early contact. The Portuguese and many early Europeans after them were unfamiliar and not sensitive to Asian cultural, economic, and political mores and practices. One of the reasons de Gama's initial foray at Calicut was unsuccessful was that he did not bring appropriate gifts from the Portuguese court to the Calicut court. Merchants always brought gifts. Diplomatic embassies brought even better gifts. De Gama brought nothing. Searching his vessel for anything to offer once he was so informed, he came up with, quote, 12 pieces of striped cloth, 6 hats, 4 strings of coral, a case of sugar, 2 casks of oil, and 2 casks of honey. Not surprisingly, his hastily gathered package was rejected as insulting. Beyond language gaps and cultural misunderstandings, relations were also not aided by different frames of reference, attitudes, and prejudices. Two authors in the Asian department at the Victoria and Albert Museum have noted that Vasco da Gama entered the Arab-dominated Indian Ocean with anti-Islamic attitudes inherited from Portuguese centuries of struggle against Muslim occupiers of the Iberian Peninsula. While at Calicut, Gama refused the facilities of a Muslim interpreter, demanding instead an Arabic-speaking Christian. Religious animosities brought by the Europeans, combined with business and national suspicions, made contact fraught with danger. This can be contrasted with a time before European contact, when the mix of merchants throughout Arabia, South Asia, and beyond was generally characterized by smoother relations based on the common interest in trade. Examination of the 11th to 14th century Geniza merchant letters discovered in an old Cairo synagogue revealed that there was, quote, a remarkable cultural plurality observed and maintained by Jewish, Muslim, and Indian merchants, among whom little religious intolerance is recorded. After claiming position of power by force in Arabia and India, Malacca on the Malay Peninsula became the Portuguese base of Asian operations for many years. Here they had contact with the Chinese, who were regular traders in the port. The Portuguese gathered information about the country and people, about navigation to China, and about Chinese imports and exports. They learned that pepper was the king of Chinese imports, along with incense, elephant tusks, tin, beads, and aromatic wood. Chinese exports included silk, sugar, and salt. After initiating trade with southern China and helping to tame rampant piracy that was terrorizing those local waters, the Portuguese secured their own beachhead just south of China during the first half of the 16th century. Next, about half a century later, the Portuguese settled in Macau. Relations with China's government were not always smooth, and military and diplomatic battles were not infrequent. From Macau, though, the Portuguese not only took over control of foreign maritime commerce heading to and from China and Europe, but they also acted as middlemen for trade between the mostly closed China and the mostly closed Japan for much of the balance of the 16th century. Macau also became the jumping off point and home base for Jesuits heading into and out of China. The Portuguese had a monopoly on this part of Asia during the 16th century, and as such, Lisbon became the center of Asian trade in Europe. The Portuguese, mighty as they were, however, were not often alone in Asia. Almost from the beginning, the other European powers were breathing down their maritime necks. Around 1520, Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese explorer in the employ of the Spanish, made the first circumnavigation of the globe. Like Columbus, Magellan headed west, but he took the southern route and crossed into the Pacific Ocean near the southern tip of South America. This westerly route to the east would be how the Spanish built their trading and colonial empire in Asia. Beginning in 1565, Spanish merchants and some missionaries crossed the Atlantic to Veracruz on the Mexican east coast, traveled overland 300 miles to Acapulco on the China Road, and then boarded galleons bringing silver and crops to Manila in the Philippines. They did this because it was supposedly an easier way to get to Asia than traveling around the Cape of Good Hope and across the Indian Ocean. Around 1580, Englishman Francis Drake made his own circumnavigation, and he too went west to get east. His compatriot Henry Hudson also sailed west on behalf of the Dutch in the early 17th century, looking for the fabled Northwest Passage and a quicker route to Cathay. The Dutch, whose Dutch East India Company was founded in 1602, attained prominence in the 17th century after securing their independence from Spain. The British East India Company was founded in 1600, and it ultimately became powerful enough during the 18th century to topple governments and take over nations. The 16th to 18th centuries were a cutthroat time to be on the seas. One man's pirate was another man's patriot. Today's ally might be tomorrow's enemy. Everyone was a competitor. Many might be spies. And rule number one was that there were no rules. Land, shipping, inventory, all were fair game. Battles, bloodshed, and betrayal were the order of the day. Yet even so, spheres of influence developed among the European powers in Asia. The Portuguese maintained their base in Macau. the Dutch consolidated the spice trade from what is now Indonesia and took advantage of the disruption of the collapsing Ming Dynasty to capture the Jingdezhen export market for Chinese porcelain in the early 17th century. As a result, they assumed a monopoly on Chinese porcelain from production in China to distribution in Europe. Meanwhile, the Spanish had colonized the Philippines, into which they imported massive quantities of silver mined from their colonies in Central and South America. The British settled down in India with a focus on cotton textiles, indigo, chintzes, and later tea and opium. And the French, whose own French East India Company wasn't formed until decades later in 1664, gained prominence in what are now Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. What was it like to travel on these seas from Europe to Asia during this time? Such journeys were brutal. They always took months and often took years. From storms to rocks to whirling eddies, from lack of winds to pirates to despair, and from cramped quarters to poor food to lack of water. They were perilous voyages. Matteo Ripa, an Italian priest who spent 13 years in China as a painter and copper engraver at the Kangxi Emperor's court, returned to China in 1724. His tale offers a chilling window into what travel was like on the seas at that time. These are Father Ripa's words from his memoirs as he accompanied his 5 Chinese protégés, taking them back to Europe. On the night of the 10th of April, 1724, we had a tremendous storm. From the roaring of the sea and the winds, it seemed as though the vessel would be dashed into 1,000 pieces at every moment. This was the first time in my life that I had seen a sea storm in all its terrific fury. Thanks to heaven, it did not last more than an hour. After this, the wind abated and was succeeded by a heavy rain, which continued to fall without intermission, till the whole crew was reduced to the greatest distress. Not only were their clothes completely soaked, but the water penetrated their chests and the cabins of the officers and injured part of the cargo. I was more dead than alive, being afflicted as usual with the seasickness, and feeling deeply for the forlorn situation of my poor Chinese who were drenched with rain and benumbed with cold. All of the competition among the 5 principal European powers led to a combustible period of military, economic, and political intrigue as they battled for supremacy. The Chinese and other Asian countries were often caught in the middle. The new European ethos was dramatically different than what the traditional powers in Asia had seen before. Both sides relied on trade as an integral component of relations. The Chinese, however, most often used the sea routes to spread and receive tribute and political influence, without formally colonizing and directly controlling the host kingdoms. They established a strong presence, backed up by military power or the threat thereof, from which to conduct business, promote the gift-giving essential to the tribute system, and conduct foreign affairs. The Europeans did not share the same mindset. They used the sea routes for political, military, and economic conquest. They were out to colonize and directly control these lands. The Shundra Emperor, the first Qing emperor to rule over China proper, evidenced the Chinese point of view in a mandate he issued in 1656 concerning foreign trade when the Dutch came calling. Quote, "The distance which divides Holland from China is so great that regular intercourse between the two countries is hardly practicable. Indeed, there is no record of any previous Dutch embassy. Aware of the long and arduous journey of the present ambassadors, we were happy to give them audience and receive their tribute presents. In earnest of our goodwill, we returned them gifts of suitable value. But when we think of the danger of storm and shipwreck that besets the passage hither, we are too solicitous of the welfare of the Dutch people to do more than permit them to send ships to China once in 8 years, what time they may sell 4 cargoes and bring presents to our court." Now contrast this Chinese attitude with repeated Dutch and Portuguese embassies to Peking throughout the late 17th century and English embassies in the late 18th century and beyond. The Europeans repeatedly presented themselves as at least equals, wanting to establish treaty relationships. They demanded residency rights in the capital, lower tariffs, and more freedom of trade throughout the country. Each were repeatedly and consistently rebuffed by a Chinese power structure that did not see foreign embassies as equals and which had never operated on a co-equal, treaty-based system of international affairs. The dichotomy in perspective would ultimately lead to grave ramifications during the latter part of contact in the 18th century with the British and the Qing dynasty. Maritime trade routes were the ancient highways of the ancient world, carrying commodities, art, ideas, people, and religion between Europe and Asia. The impact of these connections was felt at both ends. Throughout Europe, importing Chinese wares became fashionable, a sign of sophistication and culture, and imitating Chinese art and styles soon exploded in their own right. By the middle of the 17th century, Chinese porcelain, lacquer, textiles, and tea were flooding the European markets. The Dutch had taken over the porcelain export trade by this time and were commissioning pieces at the kilns of Jingdezhen with both Asian and European shapes and designs. This porcelain crockware bowl is from the Chongzhen period of the Ming Dynasty. One report has it that between 1602 and 1657, the Dutch East India Company sent 3 million pieces of Chinese porcelain to Europe. These pieces were transshipped first to their base in southern Formosa, and then through their base in Batavia, and finally onto Amsterdam for distribution throughout Europe. To protect the pieces in transit and multitask with limited space on board ship, the fragile porcelains were repacked in bags of pepper in Indonesia for the sea voyage to Europe. At the same time, imitation Chinese art created in Europe for Europeans also took off in popularity throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. This chinoiserie developed with both imagined and derivative Chinese style and designs. Pieces were not only Asian or only European, they were hybrids and amalgams, new concepts. Chinoiserie appeared as simulated in real lacquer and bamboo furniture, architectural treatments, textile patterns, and on pottery, snuff boxes, and other objects. The covered vases on the left in this slide are soft paste porcelain from Britain, and the unique peach-shaped wine pot on the right is hard paste porcelain from Germany. Both are examples of the chinoiserie of the period. Ideas about China and Chinese culture also abounded in Europe as well during this time. Discussions of Confucius and Confucian and Chinese philosophy were taken up by European intellectuals. The Jesuits commissioned a comprehensive history of China to be translated from Chinese into Latin. They also undertook to translate these 4 famous books, the Sishu, the Confucian classics. The writings of Confucius even made their way across the Atlantic to the founding fathers of America. Knowledge of the customs and history of those at the other end of the maritime highway, collections of art and literature, and so much more became essential for the European elites. People were also part of this cross-cultural knowledge train. The Europeans themselves occasionally made reverse pilgrimages. Italian Jesuit Claudio Filippo Grimaldi arrived in China in 1671. In 1686, the Kangxi Emperor sent him back to Europe on what turned out to be an 8-year mission. Other travelers were converts to Christianity. This, after all, was the reason why the missionaries were flocking to China. Their efforts were mostly a failure, but not a complete one. One of their success stories was Michael Shen Fuzong, a doctor's son and Chinese convert who became a cause célèbre in late 17th century Europe. Michael left China in 1681 to voyage to Europe in the company of his mentor, Flemish Jesuit Philippe Couplet. They were delayed a year in transit in Indonesia when they missed the last ship to sail west from Batavia near the end of the favorable wind seasons. When he finally arrived, Michael lit up European high society. He learned to speak Latin, Italian, and Portuguese. He met kings and popes, circulated among the elite, and was a bridge between East and West. He was painted here by the royal portrait painter Godfrey Kneller in London. He assisted in the Jesuit opus on Confucius and in translating the Sishu. When Michael traveled to the Bodleian Library at Oxford in 1687, he helped to catalog several dozen Chinese books and manuscripts in the collection, and he served as a tutor, assisting Thomas Hyde, the keeper of the Bodleian Library. At that time, Michael's history intersected with this unique piece of Asian maritime trade era history. While he was helping the keeper in learning Chinese and studying the basics of Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, and about Chinese inventions, he also assisted the keeper in transcribing the extensive Chinese labeling on this unique map of Southeast Asia, the Selden Map. Named after its owner, who bequeathed it to the library. The Selden Map is not as brightly illustrated as some of the others I showed, though it has in fact faded significantly over the centuries. But it is a distinctively maritime map that was produced in the early part of the 17th century. In fact, the approximately 400-year-old map looks remarkably conventional to our 21st century eyes. And it looks that way because it was drawn from the perspective of the sea. The land masses were secondary. This was innovative for the time period. There are mistakes, exaggerations, to be sure, but it nonetheless remains a remarkably accurate depiction of the then shipping routes. Faint lines, which you can't really see in the slide, but are there, chart the outbound sea routes from Quanzhou in southern China through the South China Sea and Southeast Asia. The map is a hybrid of Chinese, European, and possibly Persian and West Asian elements. The latest scientific research on the map suggests that it was likely prepared by a Chinese cartographer from southern China living in either Western Java or northern Sumatra. The mapmaker knew Chinese, the merchant trade routes, and about sea travel. Amazingly to us today, when Michael and Keeper Hyde examined the Selden Map, they made their translations, annotations, and romanizations on the face of the original map itself and wrote notes in the margins around the map edges. After leaving England, when in Lisbon, Michael Shen studied to become the first Chinese Jesuit priest. But sadly, he never had the chance. While voyaging back to China in 1690, Michael died at sea somewhere between the Cape of Good Hope and Mozambique. The cultural impact of European maritime trade contact in China prior to the 19th century was also significant. But unlike in Europe, where it spread widely throughout the continent and society, in China, it was mostly limited to the enjoyment of the emperor and the imperial court. The principal drivers of this impact in China, beginning at the tail end of the Ming Dynasty and continuing during the first half of the Qing Dynasty, were Christian missionaries. And of these, the Jesuits of the Society of Jesus are the most well-known. The Jesuits hailed from many countries in Europe. Two of the most famous of these men are pictured here, Italians Matteo Ricci and Giuseppe Castiglione. All of these European lay preachers and missionaries, Jesuit and other, brought scientific, mathematic, artistic, and other Western intellectual advances to China. The Chinese emperors learned about the outside world from the missionaries and brought news and learned the news and information about people, places, and foreign affairs. Ricci created this wall-size, 6-panel map of the world in Chinese in 1602. It's entitled The Complete Geographic Map of 10,000 Countries. He wrote in his diary that with this map, a gentleman could travel the world without leaving his study. The arts of the early Qing Dynasty emperors, from Shundra through Qianlong, reflect European influences in numerous ways. The Qianlong Emperor in particular employed European images, scenery, people, and designs on artworks. Painted enamel was introduced to the Chinese court from Europe during the late 17th century. This wine ewer is from the Palace Museum in Beijing, and it's credited to an imperial workshop and dated to probably the late 18th century during the Qianlong period. Each side contains a lobed cartouche that was created using enamel pigments on metal. As with much of Qianlong era art, the foreign innovation, in this case painted enamel, was combined with local design, Chinese-produced cloisonné. The lid is decorated with a coral finial, and the handle is in the shape of a rui scepter. The base of the spout is a dragon's mouth. This snuff bottle is a Qianlong-era gilded copper and enamel bottle from the Thompson collection at the Art Gallery of Ontario. The bottle is noted as being likely from an Beijing workshop and not only utilizes the foreign introduced enamel, but also depicts two European ladies, one on each side. This circular gilt bronze box is emblazoned with a large character for spring, a representation of the god of longevity, and 2 5-clawed imperial dragons. The box combines both cloisonné enamel and champlave enamel designs and was formerly in the Rothschild family collection. Beginning in the late Ming Dynasty, foreign timepieces and clocks were appreciated and admired by the imperial court of both the Ming and the Qing dynasties. The Jesuits played a central role in servicing the mechanical clocks that were often made in Europe and sent as diplomatic gifts. Englishman James Cox, an 18th century London jeweler and clockmaker, made a number of elaborate and ornate automaton clocks for Asia, including the Chinese imperial court. These clocks are both Cox pieces. The left piece, now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, is in the shape of a chariot pushed by a Chinese attendant. It was made in 1766 on commission by the British East India Company for the Qianlong Emperor. It was part of a paired set consisting of a gold case inlaid with gems. Springs drove the wheels of the chariot, and levers controlled the whirligig and birds being held up by the woman. The right piece on this slide is in the form of a birdcage and dates to circa 1800. The main columns of the cage are 12 pineapple trees, and the top design rotated. When Lord Macartney led his English embassy to the Qianlong court in 1793, he brought watches with him as presents. The watches, which included gold watches and several pocket watches, were crafted by the famous Ellicott family in London. While touring the Imperial Great Hall at the Yuanmingyuan Summer Palace, north of Beijing, Macartney wrote in his journal that, quote, "At one end, I observed a musical clock that played 12 old English tunes, the Black Joke, Lily Bolero, and other airs of the Beggar's Opera. It was decorated in a wretched old taste with ornaments of crystal and colored stones, but had been, I dare say, very much admired in its time. On the dial appeared in large characters, George Clark, Clock and Watchmaker in Leadenhall Street, London." Beginning in the late 17th century, the Kangxi Emperor established, and his son Yongzhen and his grandson Qianlong continued, a bureau of chiming clocks and a bureau of clockmaking in the imperial palace, dedicated to studying, producing, repairing, and conserving Western-style mechanical clocks. Now, thereafter, clockmaking also became a domestic industry in its own right throughout a number of manufacturing centers in China. The musical clock on the left side of this slide was made in the Guangzhou workshops in China during the later years of the Qianlong period. It has a gilt bronze body with paste-set gems and an enamel clock with gilt hands. The clock face measures 3.5 inches in diameter. The intricate design is a fusion of Western and Chinese design elements and includes 4 European figures and a vegetated top finial. The musical clock on the right is of the same period, but it was made in England. It is now part of the collection of the New Orleans Museum of Art. The gilt bronze clock also includes enamel and paste jewels. It is described as being made in the manner of James Cox. The clock was damaged during Hurricane Katrina and has since been restored to not only once again keep time, but also to play a series of chime tunes and spin the jeweled ornaments. This next slide, which shows 2 hat stands from the Qianlong period, are further examples of the Western influence on 18th century Chinese art. The tall hat stand incorporates a gilt bronze elephant standing on a dark blue and white glass checkered base. The elephant wears a colored glass bead harness. A European gentleman in a frock coat kneels above the beast on a floral saddle. The man holds a tray above his head upon which rests a metal vase adorned with glass and enamel decorations. Near the top are 5 gilt bronze Rui scepters set with semi-precious stones, and at the very top is an engraved lidded box with cover. The second hat stand on the right is much simpler, but it is made of gilded copper and includes a large clock face with Roman numerals. European influence significantly impacted Chinese art and glassware as well. Kylian Stumpf, a German Jesuit with a Portuguese mission, arrived in China in 1696. His voyage from Europe to Goa in 1691 saw ill winds, heavy storms, and death from diseases. While he was instrumental in many areas in China, mathematics, astronomy, calendaring, and more, he may be remembered most for establishing a famous glass factory in the imperial city west of the Forbidden City. His efforts led to a refinement in Chinese glassmaking. From telescope lenses to ruby red glass to vases, bowls, and bottles, there was a fusion of Western formulation and color with Chinese design, decoration, and iconography that thrived during the 18th century. The glassmaker who crafted this cup used European diamond point engraving to carve the flowers of the four seasons on the side panels. I found an interesting reference that this cup may fit the description of glass cups that were sent to the King of Portugal by the Sixteenth Emperor in 1722, specifically, quote, 8 small cups with flower pattern, the color of blue sky after rain. The Qianlong Emperor also instructed Castiglione and others to design and build a large Western palace complex in the northeast corner of the Yuanmingyuan in Beijing. The palaces, gardens, fountains, and mazes in this multifaceted garden of perfect brightness fused Western architectural features, eye-deceiving trompe-l'oeil perspective, in European aesthetics and Chinese cosmology and design. Qianlong also employed and recognized European imagery on paintings, enamels, and porcelains, having his artists, who were both European missionaries and their Chinese students, adopt Western techniques in Chinese creations. This Rui Tsong horse was painted by Castiglione and is an example of the foreign linear perspective and eye-deceiving trompe-l'oeil illusion that fascinated the Qianlong Emperor. Around 1748, the emperor added a poem to the painting. It's to the left of the 3 upper red seals in the center, which begins with a statement that, quote, the technique of painting solid forms in color comes from west of the sea. And he added in notes later as well that it was painted by a foreigner. I would like to conclude with a brief comment on what I referenced earlier as Rui scepters and a connection they have with maritime trade. Rui are depicted on the wine ewer and the hat stand that we viewed earlier, and they're shown on the middle and right of this slide. They're also in the name of Castiglione's horse. We call them scepters in English, but they are not specifically royal in China. Rui translates as everything as you wish. The Rui is one of the 8 Buddhist treasures, and its shape has been compared to the lingzhi, the magic fungus of immortality, which is shown here on the left of the slide. The Rui is a traditional gift signaling a wish for good fortune and prosperity. When the Macartney expedition met with the Qianlong Emperor in late 1793, the emperor bestowed 3 Rui on the Europeans as gifts. He gave one as a present from King George III, for King George, in Macartney's words, quote, as a symbol of peace and prosperity, and expressed his hopes that my sovereign and he should always live in good correspondence and amity. It is a whitish, agate-looking stone about 1.5 feet long, curiously carved and highly prized by the Chinese, but to me, it does not appear in itself to be of any great value. The emperor gave Macartney a Rui as well, a greenish-colored stone, in his words, of the same emblematic character. At the same time, he graciously accepted from me a pair of beautiful enameled watches set with diamonds. A final Rui was presented to Macartney's second-in-command, Sir George Stanton, a greenish stone nearly similar to mine, in Macartney's words. This is the Stanton Rui. It subsequently traveled back to England on the historic maritime trade routes on a European ship from China and now resides in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for the very informative presentation.